Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax.
I regret entering the abandoned mansion. The paintings were watching me. You might think I'm stupid for posting this, admitting to a crime. And yeah, you're probably right, but I don't care anymore. The person I used to be, the guy who broke into a stranger's home for thrills and a quick payday, he's long gone. My name doesn't matter. You can call me whatever you want. Let's just say this is your anonymous warning. This all started 3 years ago, back when I was still pulling small-time jobs, mostly houses in affluent neighborhoods. I wasn't a mastermind or anything, just someone with sticky fingers and a knack for finding ways inside. When I heard about the abandoned Greystone Mansion, I thought it was the perfect score. The place had been sitting empty for decades, and rumors swirled about treasures left behind by the original owners. Of course, there were also stories about why no one stayed in the mansion for long. Ghosts, curses, people vanishing without a trace. Your usual small-town nonsense. But I figured those stories kept the amateurs out, leaving more for me. I drove out one moonless night with a flashlight, a crowbar, and a backpack, ready to haul away anything that looked remotely valuable. The mansion sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by overgrown trees and weeds as tall as me. The windows were mostly shattered, and ivy climbed its walls like nature was trying to reclaim the place. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew, and every step I took on the creaking floorboards echoed through the silence. I hit the usual spots first: drawers, cabinets, anything that might hold old jewelry or forgotten cash. Found nothing but dust and rats. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. The mansion was huge, with more rooms than I could count. There had to be something worth taking. That's when I saw the portraits. They lined the walls of a long hallway on the second floor, each one larger than life and painted with unnerving detail. At first, I thought they were just your typical old money portraits. Stuffy men in suits, stern-looking women in elegant dresses. But the longer I looked, the more they unsettled me. The faces weren't just detailed, they were too lifelike. The paint seemed to glisten in the faint light of my flashlight, and the eyes, God, the eyes, they followed me wherever I went, their gazes drilling into my back even when I wasn't looking at them directly. But that wasn't what stopped me in my tracks. No, what froze me to the spot was the last portrait in the hallway. It was blank. At first, I thought it was just an empty frame, but when I stepped closer, I saw faint outlines, shapes that seemed to shift and twist the longer I stared. And at the bottom of the frame, there was a small brass plaque with a single word etched into it: unfinished. A cold dread started creeping over me, but I shook it off. This was just a painting, I told myself. Creepy one, sure, but just a painting. I turned to leave the hallway, but something caught my eye. A small, leather-bound book sitting on a pedestal near the blank portrait. Curiosity got the better of me. The book looked ancient, its pages yellowed and brittle. The text was handwritten in a language I didn't recognize, though some of it looked like Latin. Near the back of the book was a crude drawing of the hallway I was standing in, complete with the portraits, and a set of instructions. The words were written in shaky English. Stand before the unfinished. Speak the names of the chosen. Do not falter. I should have left right then and there, tossed the book, bolted down the stairs, and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I flipped back through the book, scanning the faded text for any mention of these chosen. There they were, names, dozens of them, written in a tight, slanted script. They were eerily familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd heard them before. Then, almost without thinking, I found myself standing in front of the blank portrait, the book open in my hands. As I stared at the empty canvas, my flashlight flickered and died, plunging the hallway into darkness. The silence pressed in on me like a weight, and for a moment, I considered running. But something held me there, a morbid curiosity, maybe, or sheer stupidity. I whispered the first name on the list. Nothing happened. Then the second name. Still nothing. But as I spoke the third, I heard it. A faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the walls. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the sound grew louder, circling me, closing in. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. My heart pounded as I flipped through the book, trying to figure out what I'd unleashed. That's when I felt it. A presence behind me, so close I could feel its breath on my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the portraits, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. No, not just the portraits. They were moving. The figures inside the frames shifted and writhed, their painted expressions twisting into something unrecognizable. Their eyes burned with a malevolent light, and one by one, they began to step out of their frames. Panic surged through me as I dropped the book and ran. The sound of footsteps, many footsteps, chasing me down the hallway. I didn't stop until I was out of the mansion, my chest heaving and my hands trembling. I never went back for the book, and I've spent every day since trying to convince myself it was all just a bad dream. But I know the truth. The eyes in those portraits weren't just paintings. They were people, real people, trapped in those frames, waiting for someone stupid enough to set them free. And the worst part? When I got back to my car, I caught my reflection in the window. For just a split second, my face didn't look like my own. It looked like a painting. I didn't go back to the mansion right away. For weeks, I kept telling myself to move on, to forget. But ignoring what happened wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. Started small. At first, I'd feel like someone was standing behind me when I was alone. Just a faint pressure, like the air shifting. I told myself it was paranoia, the fallout of a bad break-in that shook me up. Then things got worse. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. I began to notice people watching me, or at least I thought they were. A guy sitting across from me on the bus would stare until I turned to meet his eyes. Then he'd suddenly glance away, like nothing had happened. In line at the coffee shop, a woman behind me would shift uncomfortably, her head angled slightly in my direction. When I turned, she'd be looking at the menu, her face calm and unreadable. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence. The mind plays tricks when you're on edge, right? But it kept happening. It wasn't just random strangers, either. It was everyone. Even people I knew, friends, acquaintances, the guy at the bodega who rang me up every morning, they all started to do it. I'd catch them looking at me from the corner of my eye, their expressions blank, neutral. But when I turned my head, they'd act like nothing had happened. And then there were the smiles. Not big ones, not obvious, just the faintest curl of their lips, like they were sharing some private joke I wasn't in on. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but once I noticed, I couldn't unsee it. They all looked like they knew something. By the end of the second month, I'd stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd picture the hallway in the mansion, the way the portraits had moved, their hollow faces and grasping hands. I knew it wasn't over. Whatever I'd set free, it was still with me. I finally broke one night after a particularly bad encounter. I was walking home from the grocery store, arms weighed down by bags, when I passed an old man sitting on a bench. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, staring straight ahead. As I passed, I glanced at him, and his head turned to follow me. It wasn't a normal movement. It was too smooth, too precise, like the way the portraits had moved. I stopped dead in my tracks, the plastic bags digging into my hands. The old man didn't blink. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked on the last word. He didn't answer. He just smiled. Not a warm smile, not a kind one, just that faint, knowing curl of his lips. I staggered, the bags slipping from my grip as a few cans clattered to the ground. I didn't stop to pick them up. I just left them behind and ran the rest of the way home. The next morning, I packed my things. I couldn't explain it, but I knew staying in the city wasn't safe anymore. Maybe it was paranoia, but I didn't care. I moved to a new town, rented a cheap room in a rundown motel, and tried to start over. For a while, it worked. The people here were friendly but distant. I kept my head down, took odd jobs to pay the bills, and avoided unnecessary conversations. For the first time in months, I felt almost normal again. but it didn't last. One day, I was fixing a fence for a farmer on the edge of town when I felt it again. That prickle on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. I glanced up, and there was a woman standing at the edge of the field, half hidden by the tall grass. She wasn't moving. Her face was partially obscured, but I could tell she was staring right at me. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. She just turned and walked away, vanishing into the grass without a sound. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands. The scar on my palm from the night I shattered the display case in an antique shop had healed into a thin white line, but it still throbbed whenever I thought about the mansion. I realized then that running wasn't going to help. Whatever this was, it wasn't tied to a place. It was tied to me. I guess something in me snapped that night. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe I thought destroying the mansion would sever the connection. I didn't plan it, I just acted. I grabbed a can of gasoline from the shed behind my motel and drove back to Greystone in the dead of night. The mansion loomed ahead, its silhouette even darker against the moonless sky. The air was heavy, suffocating. As I stepped inside, the portraits were waiting, their painted eyes alive with something far worse than malice. I couldn't bring myself to look too closely, afraid I'd see them move again. Their gazes followed me down the hall as I worked, splashing gasoline on the walls, the floors, and the ornate frames that held those cursed faces. When I reached for the matchbox, my hands were trembling so badly that I dropped it. It hit the floor with a clatter, spilling matches in every direction. My heart nearly stopped as I watched the tiny sticks scatter across the soaked floorboards, a few skittering dangerously close to the gasoline. I cursed under my breath, trying to keep my cool and avoid stepping on the gasoline, because that would be a really bad idea. Crouching low, I grabbed the nearest match that hadn't been doused. My fingers fumbled as the oppressive silence seemed to press in, my heart beat loud in my ears. With shaking hands, I struck it. The flames sputtered to life, impossibly bright in the darkness. Without a second thought, I tossed it onto the gasoline-soaked floor and scrambled back as the fire erupted in a wave of heat and light. The fire roared to life, devouring everything in its path. The portraits twisted and warped in the heat, their colors bleeding and melting into one another. For a moment, I thought I heard them screaming. I didn't stick around to find out. I ran in a panic, the flames roaring at my heels as I sprinted toward the door. When I finally stumbled outside, the mansion was engulfed, its windows glowing like fiery eyes piercing the night. I stood there, gasping for breath, watching as the inferno devoured everything. I went home to my apartment believing it was over, that I'd destroyed whatever evil had taken hold of that place. Couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, I went back to Greystone, or at least what was left of it. The fire I'd set had gutted the mansion completely, leaving behind little more than a pile of ash and charred stone. The front steps still stood, blackened but intact, leading up to nothing but sky. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ruins, trying to figure out what to do. Then I saw it. Amid the rubble, something caught the light, a glint of metal. I climbed over the crumbling remains of the doorway and picked my way through the wreckage. When I reached the spot where the hallway had been, I found it. A brass plaque, scorched but still legible. Unfinished. My stomach turned. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to risk taking anything from this place ever again. But as I stood there, staring at the plaque, I felt something shift. The air grew heavy, the way it does before a thunderstorm. And then I heard it. Faint at first, almost a whisper, but growing louder with every second. Footsteps. They were coming closer. The footsteps echoed through the ruins of the mansion, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought they might belong to another unlucky thrill-seeker who had wandered into the wreckage, but something about them felt wrong. They didn't shuffle over broken debris or falter on the unstable ground. They were steady, rhythmic, like they belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were going. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. Backing away from the plaque, I turned and scrambled over the rubble, ignoring the sharp edges scraping my hands and legs. I didn't stop until I was outside, the morning sun barely cutting through the overcast sky. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were still coming, their sound impossibly clear even though no one emerged from the wreckage. I stared at the empty doorway, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for something to appear. Then I saw them, not in the doorway, but in the distance, figures standing along the edge of the property. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, scattered among the overgrown grass and skeletal trees. At first, I thought they were strangers, maybe people from the nearby town curious about the mansion. But they weren't moving. They just stood there watching me. Even though they were too far away for me to make out their faces, I knew they were staring. That same weight I'd felt for weeks was back, heavier than ever, pressing down on me like a vice. I took a step back and one of the figures shifted. Its head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging my movement. Another step, and the others started to move too. Not toward me, but around me, circling the ruins in perfect synchronization. I don't remember running to my car. One moment, I was standing there, frozen, and the next, I was behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The drive back to town was a blur. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The road was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. By the time I reached the motel, my head was pounding, and my legs felt like jelly. I locked the door behind me, shoved a chair under the handle, and collapsed onto the bed. But the feeling didn't go away. I could sense them, standing just beyond the edge of my awareness, like shadows lingering in the corner of my eye. Every sound, every creak of the old building made me jump, my mind conjuring images of the figures standing outside my window, waiting for me to look. That night, the first knock came. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, the TV on low to drown out the silence, when I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock at the door. 3 slow raps, evenly spaced. I froze, staring at the door. Then I remembered. The motel had no front desk, no housekeepers, and no reason for anyone to bother me at this hour. Another knock, louder this time. I grabbed the crowbar I'd brought back from Greystone and approached the door, my pulse racing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The third knock rattled the doorframe, and I almost dropped the crowbar. I leaned in, peering through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty, but I knew better than to trust what I saw. I stepped back, gripping the crowbar tighter, and the knock came again, this time from the window. Spinning around, I saw nothing but the drawn curtains, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. For what felt like hours, the room was silent. Then I heard it. The faint creak of floorboards, not outside, but inside the room. I turned, swinging the crowbar wildly, but there was no one there. The room was empty, exactly as I'd left it, but the sound of footsteps didn't stop. They circled me, moving just beyond the edges of the light. And then the whispers started, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on a breeze. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I knew what they wanted. The figures, the portraits, the unfinished. They weren't gone. They'd followed me, clinging to my very existence like a curse. And now they were done lurking. The whispers swelled, overlapping until they merged into a single, deafening roar. Pain shot through my skull, as if it were splitting open, and I dropped the crowbar, clutching my ears in agony. "Stop!" I screamed, but the voices only grew louder. In the haze of noise and pain, I saw them, shapes materializing in the corners of the room, their faces smooth and featureless. They didn't move like people. They glided, their limbs bending unnaturally as they closed in. I stumbled, my foot catching on loose rubble and throwing me off balance. My hand shot out instinctively, reaching for the crowbar, but instead, it closed around something cold and metallic. The plaque shouldn't have been there. I left it at the mansion, I was sure of it, but there it was, sitting on the motel desk as if it had always been there. The figures stopped, their blank faces turning toward the plaque in unison. I had no idea what I was doing, but I grabbed it anyway, clutching it like a shield. Is this what you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling as the words stumbled out. The figures froze, their heads tilting as if considering the question. Then, one by one, they began to retreat, fading into the shadows until the room was empty again. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stared at the plaque, the word unfinished gleaming faintly in the dim light. Deep down, I understood this wasn't the end. It was the start of something far worse. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every sound, every flicker of a shadow felt like one of those figures returning, lurking just out of sight in the corners of my room. By dawn, I came to a grim conclusion. I couldn't keep running. Whatever this was, it wouldn't stop until I faced it. The plaque sat on the motel desk, its brass surface tarnished and dull, but the word etched into it, unfinished, seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. I didn't know what it wanted me to do, but I had a feeling the mansion held the answers, or what was left of it. I returned to Greystone as the sun rose higher, the ruins almost peaceful under the light. But the calm was deceptive. The air still carried that oppressive weight, like the place itself was watching me. I walked through the rubble, my boots crunching on charred wood and shattered stone, until I reached the heart of the mansion. The plaque seemed to grow heavier in my hand the closer I got, like it was pulling me toward something. And then I saw it. A trapdoor partially obscured by debris. I don't know how I'd missed it before. It looked old, the wood scorched but still intact, with a rusted iron handle. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't ignore the pull of the plaque. I knelt and yanked the trapdoor open. Beneath it was a set of stone stairs spiraling into darkness. The air grew colder as I descended, the faint smell of ash giving way to something earthier, damp soil, rotting wood. My flashlight barely pierced the gloom, but the stairs went on, deeper than should have been possible. Finally, I reached the bottom. The room was small, the walls carved directly into the stone, and at its center was a pedestal. On it rested an object covered in a dark, tattered cloth. I approached slowly, the plaque in my hand vibrating slightly, as if urging me forward. With a deep breath, I reached out and pulled the cloth away. Underneath was another painting. It was just like the others, the frame ornate and gilded, the canvas impossibly detailed. But this one wasn't of a person. It was of a scene, a field, overgrown and wild, with a single figure standing in the distance. It looked familiar, but I couldn't place why, until I realized the perspective was mine. The painting showed me, standing where I'd been earlier that morning, staring back at the mansion. As I stared at the painting, the figure in it began to move, turning slowly to face me. Its features were blurred, distorted, but its posture was unmistakable. It wasn't just watching me, it was mimicking me, and then it smiled. The walls of the room trembled, dust raining from the ceiling as the figure in the painting stepped closer. My flashlight flickered, and the air grew thick, almost liquid, making it harder to breathe. I staggered back, clutching the plaque like a lifeline. The figure reached the edge of the canvas, its distorted features pressing against the surface as if trying to break free. I didn't think, I just acted. Raising the plaque, I slammed it into the painting with all my strength. The canvas tore with a sound like a scream, the edges curling and blackening as the room erupted into chaos. The walls cracked, the floor buckled, and the pedestal crumbled into dust. A deafening roar filled the air as shadows poured from the painting, swirling around me like a storm. I ran, scrambling back up the stairs as the room collapsed behind me. The shadows clawed at my heels, their whispers deafening, but I didn't stop. I burst through the trapdoor just as the last of the staircase crumbled into darkness. When I reached the surface, the ruins were still. The oppressive weight that had hung over the mansion was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. The plaque was gone too, along with the shadows. For the first time in months, I felt free. That was 3 years ago. I've tried to move on, to live a normal life, but there's always a part of me that wonders. The mansion's ruins were cleared a few months after I left. The land sold to a developer. They built a row of luxury homes there, all sleek glass and polished stone. I read about it in the paper, saw photos of smiling families posing in front of their new homes. But I can't help wondering if they feel it too. That faint pressure, that sense of being watched. I've stopped looking over my shoulder, stopped jumping at shadows. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in a room, I'll catch the faintest sound. Footsteps. Not close. No, but they're there. They're always there.
Thanks for listening to today's story. Let us know what you think. If you want to hear more scary stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here and welcome you.